So, the same issue arises when we turn to the other form of rationalism, when we turn to judgment rationalism. Here's how Leibniz frames the issue. There is the question whether the soul in itself is entirely empty, like a writing tablet on which nothing has yet been written, a tabula rasa. That's the opinion of Aristotle, he says, and the author of the essay, Locke. And whether everything that's inscribed upon it comes solely from the senses and experience. Before I go on here, let me just point out, this is a very famous passage. Often people will describe the empiricist as somebody who believes in a tabula rasa, that the mind is a blank slate. Actually, Locke never uses that term. The term comes from Leibniz's criticism of Locke, where he says, this is the view underlying the view of Aristotle, the view of Locke, that in the end, well, the mind comes to us initially as just a blank slate. Locke's term is actually, it comes to us as a white sheet of paper on which nothing has been written. And then everything written on it comes from experience. It comes from perception. Anyway, that's one view. That's the view of Aristotle, of Locke, of the empiricist. But Leibniz says, or, and now he's going to give you the rationalist view, whether the soul originally contains the principles of several notions and doctrines, which are merely roused on certain occasions by external objects, as I hold, along with Plato, and even with the schoolmen. By the schoolmen, he means the scholastic philosophers of the medieval period, so people like Aquinas, for example. So that's the contrast he's drawing, both with respect to the notions, that is to say the ideas and concepts, but also, crucially here, with respect to the principles, the doctrines. Are they all things that we learn on the basis of experience, or does the soul, the mind, originally contain some of these? Does it already come equipped with certain kinds of knowledge? Now notice he does say, they're roused on certain occasions by some objects. It may be that there's a bit of knowledge that I'm born with, but I don't even recognize it. It's there dispositionally, but it doesn't become a current until it's triggered in some way. Or maybe some of these require repeated triggering. It's there, and I do have that capacity, but it takes a while for it to happen. It's not like the first time I see something, immediately, I recognize it. Maybe it takes me a while to recognize it. And that's why, by the way, psychologists still debate this issue. The baby, for example, will start recognizing objects as distinct objects, somewhere between 6 and 9 months old. It's the same with causation. They will start being surprised, for example, if a rubber ducky turns into a train when it goes behind a screen and comes out the other side. Until then, they're really not that surprised. Rubber ducky comes in, emerges as a rubber ducky. Oh, rubber ducky comes in, emerges as a train. Oh, pretty much the same thing to the baby until it's 6 to 9 months old. And then suddenly it sees the rubber ducky go in and come out. Yeah, rubber duck. And then it sees it turn into a train. It's like, oh, and what's going on there? The empiricists will say the baby has learned something about what objects are and that they generally persist over time and that something surprising has happened. The rationalists will say the baby always had that ability. It was born with that ability, but it had to experience enough of these surprises for that to be triggered, for that thing to stop being merely dispositional and to become a current. And so is that something that's been tucked in the recesses of the mind and then has to be triggered through some repetition? Or is that something that the baby is learning from experience? And learning, hey, things tend to go constantly. Hands don't suddenly turn into rubber ducks. Rubber ducks don't suddenly turn into trains. And eventually they figure out, hey, it's pretty surprising if something like that appears to happen. Well, in any case, that idea that certain things are lurking there but have to be triggered, maybe triggered by repeated experiences, that's something that makes this a hard issue to evaluate and decide. So here are the two models. Locke's a blank sheet of paper. White paper, nothing's been written on it yet. We don't yet have any of the ideas. The light bulb there is meant to symbolize an idea. That's not yet in or on the paper. It's something that has to be added through experience. And so we have to gain our ideas from experience. We have to write down bits of knowledge on that tablet from experience. Notice sometimes experience makes us erase something on the tablet. We form some conclusion and then we take it back on the basis of further perception and experience. All swans are white, people thought for decades, even centuries, until in the middle of Australia, people found black swans. And suddenly they had to erase all swans are white and put down something else. So it can be gaining that new idea, it can be writing down a bit of knowledge, it can be erasing something that it turns out wasn't true. Leibniz's picture is different. He says the mind is like marble, and it already comes with a structure. Certain things are already there. And so what does a sculptor do? They have to look at the faults in the marble. And if they're going to sculpt something, they have to realize, I have to pay attention to that. I can't turn this into a certain kind of shape if those striations are going to mean it's going to be weak. And as soon as I try to cut the marble there, this whole part is going to fall off. So there's already a structure in the marble that there isn't in the white sheet of paper. Now notice, there's no sculpture yet in that piece of marble. And so it's rather like nothing is yet occurrent. But dispositionally, there's a lot there. That bit of marble has a lot of dispositions about what kinds of shapes it can form, what kinds of shapes it's going to be very difficult to make it go into. Whereas the white sheet of paper is not like that. It really doesn't place many constraints on what's written on it. So the empiricist is going to say the mind is like that white sheet of paper, nothing yet written on it when we're born, and then experience writes on it. Leibniz, no, the mind is like this, and experience sculpts it, but much of the way it's going to end up looking is already determined by the structure it has, even at birth. Well, the judgment rationalist, then, to summarize, says there is a priori knowledge of the world, knowledge independent of experience. It is truly a priori. We don't need to derive it from experience, though experience might be required to trigger it. It's also a priori in the sense that it is something that is, you might say, hardwired in. It's built into us. It is something we can obtain by an understanding of the structure of our own minds, not experience of the outside world. But also, it is really knowledge of the world. It is not simply an a priori knowledge that you might say is purely logical, purely verbal. It's not like a bachelor is an unmarried man, where you might know that just on the basis of knowing the meanings of the words. It's something else. We've drawn separately in separate videos some distinctions. And we can use those distinctions to formulate this in a bit of philosophical vocabulary. One distinction is semantic. Analytic statements have their truth value determined by the meanings of their terms. So bachelors are unmarried is a good example. It's true, and you don't have to know anything about the real world. It would be foolish to apply for a grant to study the question of whether bachelors are unmarried. Of course they are. That's the meaning of the term. And so there's nothing to investigate. It doesn't tell you anything about the world. It simply tells you something about the meaning of the term bachelor. A synthetic statement is really about the world. The truth value depends on the world, not merely on the meanings of terms. So a synthetic statement is something that you would expect to actually have to investigate the world to find out. If somebody makes the claim bachelors are unhappy, well, that's a claim about the world. It's not built into the concept or the meaning of the term bachelor. But bachelors are unmarried, that really is simply built into the meaning of the term. So that distinction is one we can use because when we talk about something being a priori knowledge of the world, we mean it's synthetic. It's not merely analytic knowledge like bachelors or bachelors are unmarried. It's something really about the world. The second distinction is the epistemic distinction I've already mentioned between the a priori and the a posteriori. The a priori is knowable independently of experience. A posteriori, knowable only through experience. There's a bit of squishiness there. Knowable by whom? And knowable in fact or in principle. But again, I've talked about that separately. The issue is simply, from Leibniz's point of view, and really from the point of view of this entire Enlightenment debate, knowable for us. Knowable in fact for us. And that's something that, well, is usually not at stake when we think about the various issues that psychologists debate, for example, or that philosophers worry about. It's something knowable for us, and it's not something that we have to worry about infinite procedures or other complicated things to think about whether it would be knowable under those circumstances. Well, here's how we then might frame the thesis of judgment rationalism. It's the view that there are synthetic a priori truths. There are truths that are synthetic. They are really about the world, not merely about the meanings of terms, but also they are a priori. They're things we can know independently of experience. So we could simply put it this way without the jargon: we can learn something about the world independently of experience, from reason alone, just from reflection on the structure of our own minds, our own innate concepts, and the innate principles that are given to us at birth. So Leibniz says there is another question, whether all truths are dependent on experience, that is, on induction and instances, or whether there's some that have yet another foundation. He's asking whether all truths are a posteriori, based on induction, instances, perception of the world, or whether there are some that have another foundation, that are truly a priori. So if that's the issue that divides the rationalist from the empiricist, we can frame it this way. One distinction is the semantic distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. The other, the epistemic distinction between the a priori and a posteriori. Nobody thinks in this entire period that anything could be analytic and a posteriori. If it follows simply from the meanings of the terms, all I have to know is language. I don't have to have any experience of the world. So everyone agrees that analytic statements are all a priori. I can know those just by knowing my language. Now, of course, it requires some experience to learn my language, but assume that the language is simply given. Then, if I know the language, I don't need any further experience of the world. I already have certain things that I know a priori, namely analytic things. They're about language, they're not about the world. I also have synthetic a posteriori knowledge, and everybody agrees about that. That's something that when I know, hey, some dogs are black, or I am jingling keys. Those things are things that are really statements about the world. They don't follow from the meanings of the terms. So they're synthetic, they're a posteriori. I have to learn them from experience. The real question is whether anything is synthetic and a priori. It's really about the world, that's the synthetic part, but it's also something we could know independently of experience. That's the a priori part. Well, the empiricist says, no, there's nothing like that. Okay, there are no synthetic a priori judgments. Everything that is a truth about the world is derived from experience. So all synthetic statements are a posteriori. All analytic statements are a priori. And if you look at that box, you can recognize, aha, the empiricist is saying there are really only two kinds of truths. There are those that are analytic and a priori, that we can know independently of experience just by knowing language, so they're purely verbal, or there are things that are really about the world, and all of them are derived from experience. Every bit of knowledge has to fit into one of those two boxes. Every truth has to fit into one of those two boxes. The judgment rationalist, on the other hand, says, no, there are synthetic a priori truths. Some of my knowledge of the world, much of it even, is coming from experience. But some knowledge of the world comes from another source. It is something built into the mind itself, and so those are things I can derive a priori. I can know them independently of experience. Well, why do people see these connections? Here's one way of thinking about something. Suppose some judgment is analytic. The truth value is determined by the meanings of the terms. So it doesn't depend on the world, it just depends on language and on meaning. It can be known just by knowing meanings, independently of experience. So it's a priori. That's the kind of argument that connects being analytic to being a priori. And everybody agrees with that part. So if you think of it this way, think of the a priori as they're in that sort of salmon-colored circle, and the light gray circle being the judgments that are analytic. Everybody agrees nothing is analytic and a posteriori off on that right side. And everybody agrees some things are, well, almost everybody. There are some 20th century philosophers who disagree. But everyone of the Enlightenment period thinks that there are things that are analytic and a priori, things like bachelors are unmarried. The question is about whether there is anything a priori that is not analytic. That's where I have the blue question mark. And so here's the controversial part of this. Suppose we start with the thought that we've got a synthetic judgment. It is really about the world. The truth value depends on the world. So knowing it, the idea is, requires experience of the world. So it has to be a posteriori. Synthetic, then, implies a posteriori, and that's equivalent to saying a priori implies analytic. So that's the view of the empiricist. The empiricist will say there is nothing out there in that category of the synthetic and a priori. Everything a priori is analytic. Everything that's synthetic has to be a posteriori.